Welcome to the Clothed in Glory campaign, where we hold gender justice conversations. This is one of 7 episodes that are available on YouTube. You can find the rest of the videos in our playlist under Clothed in Glory.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first of the launch of Clothed in Glory, a campaign that will talk about fashion as a way to practice our faith and advocate for justice. My name is Paola Fuentes Gleghorn, and I'm the Immigration and Women and Girls Campaign Manager for SojoAction. And I'm so glad that you've all joined us for the launch as we honor Women's History Month, International Women's Day that happened earlier this week. And before we get started, I want to do a quick exercise with all of you. I want you to reach deep into the pockets of the clothes that you are wearing. First of all, do the clothes that you are wearing have any pockets? And if they do, how much are you able to fit into them? Go ahead and try it. So it is very likely that if you are wearing clothes traditionally marketed to men, you will be able to fit your entire hand and a wallet and potentially even your cell phone. But if you are wearing clothes traditionally marketed to women, it is likely that either A, your clothes don't have any pockets, or B, if they do, you're struggling to fit your pinky or even like the tips of your fingers into them. Or even worse, your clothes have fake pockets that are just for decoration, but then when you go try and put something in them, you realize they're not real pockets. So I want to share with you a little bit about the history of pockets. As women's fashion changed to be more form-fitting in the late 1700s in Europe and the United States, sewn-in pockets like we have today were removed from women's clothing. Pockets were reserved for people who could own property, who needed to carry money or documents or even weapons. This decision makes it clear that women were viewed as ornaments, just to look at. They didn't need to carry these things, or if they did, they had husbands or fathers who could carry these important things for them. However, as women began to organize for the right to vote and for women to have equal political and financial standing with men, women started teaching other women how to sew their own pockets into their clothes so that they could navigate public spaces unaccompanied and carry these important documents that supported their organizing for equality. For example, what became known as the suffragette suit, popular in 1910, had at least 6 pockets. The World Wars also contributed to women gaining access to more pockets as they joined the workforce while men were fighting in the wars. Many women started wearing more practical clothing for work, like pants or clothing with large pockets. But once the war was over and men came back from the war to their jobs, there was a push for women to get rid of the manly styles that they had been wearing while the men were fighting in the wars and to dress and behave in more feminine ways. Once again, women's clothing returned to being more form-fitted and slimmer. So pockets were taken back out of women's clothing. Furthermore, as handbags and purses industry began to grow, pockets were seen as even more unnecessary for women. While purses do have a use and they're fun to wear and to choose as an accessory, it's hard to deny the convenience of pockets for mobility, independence, and the ability to navigate public spaces. Purses are larger, more easily stolen, and often need to be held in your hand, or you're constantly having to make sure they stay on your shoulder. So we can still see the vestiges of the same sexist ideas that originally removed pockets from women's clothing. Not only that, but we are still working for the same goals as women a century ago. We are still working for women to have equal financial and political standing with men. We have not obtained equal work for equal pay. We have not been able to enforce protections against domestic and sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence fully. We do not have equal rights. We have not even been included in the United States Constitution under the Equal Rights Amendment that would prohibit any discrimination based on sex. But like women who taught other women to sew their own pockets during the movement for women to have the right to vote, we see fashion continue to be used to advance gender equality today. During the 2017 Women's March, patterns for how to sew hats were shared on the internet to create a visual impact during the marches around the country and the world of women and allies all wearing pink hats. So throughout the Clothing Glory campaign, we'll continue to learn about the history of fashion and how it has been used, unfortunately, to oppress people, but also to liberate people and advance justice. So why did people wear their Sunday best or denim during the civil rights movement? Why does the image of the red dress hold such power for advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women? Why do faith leaders wear clergy collars or stoles during marches and protests, and our own president getting arrested here wearing his clergy stole? Or why did Mexican and Chicana women and non-binary people wear suits in the 1940s? So Clothing Glory, faith, fashion, and social justice is a space to think critically and engage in fashion and advocacy as a way to live out our faith. Each month during our monthly calls that we'll hold on the first Friday of every month at noon, we will be answering one of these questions and exploring the ways that fashion has and continues to strengthen social justice movements. So we invite you to clothe yourself in glory, which is another pillar of this campaign, that we are made in the image of God, and therefore our bodies and how we clothe them are glorious. And we invite you to advocate for a world where all people are given equal respect, opportunity, and protection. A sustainable world that pursues climate justice, and a world where the rights of all workers are protected. So we'll jump into a little bit of an icebreaker now. And so we'll put you in breakout rooms. So we want to discuss these two questions. What is a favorite item of clothing or an accessory that you own or you're maybe wearing right now? And why is it so meaningful? And then what are some Bible stories or verses or themes that come to mind when you think about clothing and dress and fashion? Now I want to talk a little bit about the connection between fashion and social justice. Why are we talking about fashion when we could be talking about so many other social justice issues? And now I want to talk to you about how they're actually very interconnected. So we know that fashion can spark joy and invite self-expression. There can be pleasure and joy in getting dressed and styling our hair and picking out our jewelry and accessories. Fashion is also a way to define our identity, to remember the gloriousness of our bodies, and to reclaim agency over our bodies and lives. How many of you have seen these images by illustrators depicting traditional Ukrainian clothing to call for peace? So here are just a couple of examples, but I'm sure many of you have seen others. We also know that First Lady Jill Biden wore a sunflower, which is the national flower of Ukraine, to stand in solidarity with people in Ukraine. Or here we see the Queen of Spain also wearing the traditional Ukrainian shirt to stand in solidarity with Ukraine. So fashion can empower us to take action and advocate in ways that make a difference. But fashion can also be a source of dread. Designers and brands don't always produce clothes that fit every body. And oppressive designs seek to make people fit into these dominant expectations around gender, disability, race, and class. When we dress in countercultural ways, we directly confront systems of oppression. For many queer and trans people, people who are disabled, and people who are fat identified, the very act of getting dressed can be an act of resistance and a challenge to these oppressive systems. By wearing clothes that bring joy and showcase our bodies, provide access to our bodies, and express who we are, people in these groups are participating in a form of protest. And these oppressive systems often respond to these forms of protest with violence. For example, when gender nonconforming people wear clothes that do not fit into society's expectations around gender, they are targeted with harassment and even violence. But if fashion can be used to oppress people, it can also liberate us. When we participate in a march wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, like the one I have on today, or a pink hat, or when we collectively wear white pearls, it creates a sense of group identity, of community, and connection to one another. This coordinated look becomes an expression of our collective power, and it creates a visual impact. Our collective embodied activism can visually disrupt these systems of oppression that seek to erase us. Like we talked about earlier, during the 2017 women's marches, many people wore pink pussy hats. The pussy hats were pink hats knitted or crocheted or sewn by women involved in the 2017 Women's March. And the idea came from two women, Krista Suh and Jana Seulman, who worked with a local craft store to develop the pattern for the hats. They began advertising the pattern for the hats with the goal of having 1 million hats to pass out at the march. Many of the hats that were worn during the march were made by people who were not able to be physically present at the march, but still wanted to contribute to the movement. And the idea of the pink pussy hat was in response to, as a form of protest to Trump's inauguration. And so that's why they wanted to have 1 million hats in the DC march. And it was also something in response to President Trump's derogatory remarks around women. And one of the women who started the idea of having everybody wear these pink hats said she realized the potential. And she said, we could all wear them and make a unified statement. And so we can see how this fashion played a role as we see these images of all these women and allies wearing these pink hats to protest the sexism and patriarchy that the then president of the United States was spewing at this national and international level. I also want us to look at the hoodie as another example. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to find this video under our resources to watch the full thing, and I highly encourage you to. But we'll just look at the part where they talk about hoodies. So as you can see, after the murder of Trayvon Martin, people protested wearing hoodies, putting themselves at risk of further violence from police officers. So they both created this visual impact, disrupting the systems of oppression, but then we see the risk of violence that's carried when we engage in these forms of protest fashion. So I want you to take a moment to think about this and type it in the chat, but is there a piece of clothing that you have worn to a march that's significant to you? And why did you wear it? Thinking about how we may have already participated in a form of protest fashion, of using fashion as a way to advance justice. Now we'll take a moment to go back into these breakout rooms and think about the connection between fashion and faith. And so we'll talk both about how fashion is an embodied spiritual discipline and how fashion can be a part of lament, repentance, and protest. So there's a resource with a couple of Bible verses, although you can feel free to add others into the discussion and some of the ones that we shared earlier in the call. And then there's some discussion questions. So you don't have to spend all your time reading all the Bible verses, but especially think about the questions, the discussion questions in the resource. So under looking at faith as an embodied spiritual discipline, we're looking at Exodus 28 verses 2 through 5, 1 Chronicles 15 verses 27 through 28, and 1 Corinthians 6 verse 19. And some of the discussions questions that we'll be talking about are based on these verses. How do you see getting dressed in clothing as a spiritual discipline? And then another question is, what is one thing that you can incorporate into your daily routine that can help you practice getting dressed as a spiritual discipline? Then we'll have some time to look at some verses around fashion as lament, repentance, and protest. There we'll look at 1 Chronicles 21 verses 14 through 16, at Esther 4 verses 1 through 3, and at Matthew 3 verses 1 through 6. And some of the discussion questions around these verses or others that come to mind will be based on these verses. How do you see getting dressed in clothing as a form of lament, repentance, and protest? What are some current examples where you see fashion and clothing be used as a form of lament and repentance and protest? And finally, what is one way that you can incorporate fashion and clothing into how you practice justice and/or protest injustice? So we'll take some time in our breakout rooms to talk through these verses and these discussion questions, and then we'll come back and share some of the learnings or some of the themes that we discussed. Well, thank you so much for sharing those great insights. Also, as part of this campaign, we already talked about that there's 4 main components. So we did some of this around faith resources on our bodies and the gloriousness of our bodies, and how we adorn them and dress. We'll also have a little bit of the history of fashion and how it's been used in social justice movements. And then we'll have some embodied practices that we can do as individuals or with others in our community, and advocacy actions. So throughout this campaign, you'll be invited to take action through these individual efforts. And we hope that you'll be sharing what you're learning with others around you in your community, continuing these conversations. You know, the times that we had for discussion were short. We only have an hour every month, but we hope that you're continuing these conversations with others and sharing what you're learning. We'll have these communal exercises and communal embodied practices that we can do. We'll have advocacy actions. And then when we come back in April for our next monthly meeting, we'll have some time of reflection of how did it go to practice some of these actions. And so next week, you'll get a follow-up email that will contain these more detail around these actions. But for this month, as it's Women's History Month, so there are actions that you can be taking around faith and fashion and gender. So one of these is practice your answer to that question that we talked about earlier. What is one thing you can incorporate into your daily routine that can help you practice getting dressed as a spiritual discipline? So go ahead and try it. And then when we come back to our next meeting in April, we'll share, how did it go? What did you practice? Maybe it was something that you heard someone else share. Feel free to also use that. And then as it's Women's History Month, interview some important women in your life. And in the follow-up email, there will be some sample questions that you can use. And listen to their story, record some of that story as a way to honor that history. And then for our advocacy action, as I was talking earlier, how we're still fighting for equality. And it's time that we have gender equality in the Constitution and in our laws. And one way that we can do that is through the Equal Rights Amendment. So you can take action to email your senators to ask them to work to add the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution. And as I said, you'll get a follow-up email with more details around these actions. And we hope that throughout the month of March, you'll be putting into practice some of these embodied practices, taking some of these advocacy actions. And then when we come back in April, we'll have some time to reflect on how it went to practice these things. And so also, we hope that this campaign will be something that you want to do in community with others, that if you can think of one other person that you want to invite to join you in learning and putting into practice these individuals and community practices and taking advocacy action. And my hope for this campaign is really not to make people feel guilty around what clothes they wear, where they get their clothes, because I know that faith and the society at large has used fashion to oppress us, to shame us, to make us feel worthless. And that is not the aim of this campaign. The aim of this campaign is really for us to incorporate some intentionality around dress, around fashion, and especially in how they help us practice faith, practice justice, and especially how they help us practice that in embodied ways. So, for example, we know that one important thing to our faith is living in right relationship with creation. And fashion can be a way to help us do that through ensuring that our clothes are made in sustainable ways. But this is not about making individuals feel guilty, but this is our collective responsibility. And so one big aspect of this campaign is that we'll be advocating to change systems that cause injustice to our world and to the people who are making our clothes, so that when we go to make individual choices around what we're gonna wear, where we're getting our clothes, we can be ensured that the systems behind people making our clothes, behind where our clothes are coming from, the materials, are systems that are just, so that we know that our individual actions make a difference. But when we come together and advocate to change systems, we know that we can have greater impact. And so, as I said, it's not about these individual guilt around our decisions, but this collective responsibility to create better systems for everyone. I also invite you to share about the campaign on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, so we have more people join. You can find sample tweets at soja.net/clothing-glory, or you can share from our Facebook or our Instagram so that we can have even more people joining. And as I mentioned, so that we can have this community where we're continuing these conversations throughout the month, and then we come back together, learn a little bit more, share reflections on the actions or what we were discussing, and learn about new actions that we can be taking that month. Well, thank you so much for joining this campaign. I'm so excited that you're all here. Thanks for those who are watching the recording. I hope that you do share and that you are taking, just pick one action that you will do as an individual, one action that you'll do with others around you, and do the advocacy action. And I will see you all again in April. Bye.
Thanks for watching one of the 7 episodes of Clothed in Glory. And don't forget to subscribe to support SojoAction's work and see more content like this.